Hello, my name is Kei Ueda. I'm curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection at the Hoover Institution Library Archives and the editor of Fanning the Flames, Propaganda in Modern Japan. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Fanning the Flames speaker series. We also have an accompanying online exhibition website at fanningtheflames.hoover.org, which I encourage you to visit after the talk. In addition, our exhibition, located in Hoover Tower, is open to the public through July 2022. Reservations are required, so please check the website for details. We'd like to thank the director of the Hoover Institution, Condoleezza Rice, for her support of the library and archives and our programs. And we would also like to thank the overseers of Hoover Institution, our board of directors, and other donors, without whose support, nothing we do would be possible. Now, just a few housekeeping notes. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the program for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen to type your question. Without further ado, now let me introduce you to today's moderator. Professor Alice Tseng is the Department Chair of History and Art and Architecture and Professor of Japanese Art and Architecture at Boston University. Her research focuses on Japan from the 19th century to the present, especially the history of cities, buildings, and visual arts in response to exchanges with Europe and the United States. She's the author of numerous publications, including the Imperial Museums of Meiji Japan, Architecture and the Art of the Nation, University of Washington Press, 2008, Kyoto Visual Culture in the Early Edo and Meiji Periods, The Arts of Reinvention, co-edited with Morgan Pitelka, Routledge, 2016, and Modern Kyoto, Building for Ceremony and Commemoration, 1868 to 1940, University of Hawaii Press, 2018. Now it's to you, Professor Tseng.
Thank you very much. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Shaoqian Zhang, or Zhang Shaoqian, is the Associate Professor of East Asian Art History at Oklahoma State University. She received her BA in Archaeology from Beijing University and MA and PhD in Art History from Northwestern University here in the United States. She's a specialist of 20th century Chinese art and architecture. Dr. Zhang is the author of an edited book on international art education and several peer-reviewed articles and chapters on a wide range of subjects. So she's truly interdisciplinary. I note just a few of them. The first one is one that compared urban planning in traditional China and the American West that was published in the journal Architects. There was another very interesting sounding article on the modern concept of the new woman, published in Dao, a journal of comparative philosophy. And then yet another fascinating sounding article on the Kuomintang and Chinese Communist Party propaganda imagery that was published in the journal 20th Century China. And I note that she also has been a very active curator of exhibits on Chinese art and visual culture. And once again, the number and types of shows that she has an incredible breadth of knowledge on many subjects. And so the various exhibits cover Chinese arts and visual culture, including contemporary to traditional painting, folk art, bookmaking, and propaganda posters. Dr. Zhang has a book in progress. It's titled The Front Lines of Visual Conquest, War, Party State, and Propaganda in Modern Chinese Print Art. So I'm very excited to see that come out soon. She'll today speak about the Sino-Japanese propaganda imagery, focusing on 1930s and 40s. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Zhang, and I'm very looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for the great introduction. And let me start sharing my screen. Okay, So first, thank you very much for inviting me to this really exciting exhibition programming event, Fanning the Flame, Propaganda in Modern Japan. As a Chinese art historian whose specialty is 20th century Chinese art, I'm extremely honored to be able to share my research on the Japanese military government visual strategies when facing the Chinese audience from the perspective of political posters and cartoons, as well as its reception within the Chinese audience in the occupied area in northern part of China. For some scholars for a long time, useful illustration is a visual affirmation of other evidence or attractive means of breaking up the dense text of the research book. However, in reality, those political images were and are not passive reflectors of reality, nor were they passively received by the readers. Rather, they help crystallize attitude. It is this ability to simplify and essentialize that makes the propaganda images so powerful as an art form. In part because of the emotive nature, their relative immediacy, and their many layers of meanings, propaganda images are an excellent way of assessing past attitude. With some lines and a few words, we were instantly back in the center of the conflict and the personality of the day. Well, some sees their form and content a powerful weapon and can manipulate public opinions. Their true value for historians and art historians lies in the way that they reflect the idea and the prejudice of their creators and intended audience, utilizing visual strategies. So my talk will start with the night of July 7, 1937, and the Chinese-Japanese troop engaged in a firefight in the vicinity of the Lugo Bridge, a crucial access route to Beijing. Only a few months after this incident, essential cities in the surrounding region fell to Japanese forces. Although the two countries had fought on and off ever since 1931, full-scale war did not commence until 1937, and ended only with the surrender of Japan at the end of World War II. The 8 years of the Second Sino-Japanese War opened the way for the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and which eventually overthrew and replaced the previously dominant party, the Chinese Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, or GMD. Japan, on the other hand, had to abandon its imperialistic aspiration and redefine its role, not only within East Asia, but also with respect to the West. So my talk examines the media war unleashed upon the Chinese population by the forces of Japan and China during this war. And precisely, I'm comparing and contrasting the mass-produced wartime political posters and cartoons, mostly commissioned by the military government agency, facilitated by mass media such as newspapers, flyers, and New Year picture production and distribution tradition system, aiming toward the Chinese audience. A visual method of persuasion and indoctrination appeared to both sides of conflict because of the low level of literacy in China and the strong folk-oriented visual tradition of the Chinese people. To mobilize popular support for the receptive military government, those political artists rely not only upon existing century-old pictorial vocabularies, but create new ones as well. Chapter 1, Nianhua, New Year pictures. As far as the pre-existing popular pictorial tradition are concerned, China's Nianhua, New Year picture had been the most prevalent form of shared art among the Chinese people from the time of the Qing Dynasty. Produced by woodblock printing technique, they were made for popular consumption as a means of expressing hope for the prosperity on the occasion of the Chinese New Year. Such images would adorn walls of a common household for an entire year and would be replaced during festivals. The major pictorial themes of Nianhua are quite predictable. Folk religious deities such as the ghost hunter Zhonghui, as you see on the left, the stove god and his wife, as you see from the print on the right, and a local customer, historical episode, dramatic stories, and image of happy round-faced babies. With such imagery, Nianhua were able to draw a much larger audience than books or any other printed media in the late imperial China. Different from ukiyo-e, Nianhua usually serves religious purposes and functions as a family shrine where people can send their prayers. As historian James Flass argues, quote, Nianhua offers simple solution to simple problem. The production of the art form appear highly prescriptive, end quote. For ordinary people in China, in the late imperial China, who could not afford expensive hand scrolls or hanging scrolls and who were not interested in purchasing printed book, Nianhua became one of the very few venues for their access to art in any form. And the format and design of the Nianhua are also quite standardized. They feature usually an iconic image in the center and a calendar on top, or sometimes there's no calendar in Nianhua as well. From the early 19th century onwards, the printing of the Nianhua was commercialized in the workshop urban centers such as Tianjin and Suzhou. They were produced into millions of copies every year by famous Nianhua studios using wood blocks. In addition to promoting auspiciousness, they occasionally illustrate conservative ethical values such as filial piety and orderly social class structures. Nianhua played a functional role in fostering moral ideals under the Qing Dynasty. This Nianhua, for example, first published under the Kangxi regime, features two officials carrying a board with one row and two columns of large inscriptions. And the horizontal inscription reads, Secret Order. The two columns correspond to 6 important moral qualities advocated by the Kangxi Emperor. The Kangxi ordered his official to distribute such template among a number of local Nianhua studios as a way of educating people through a vernacular art form. As such, the state borrowed a popular art form and distribution system to direct its own form of communication from the center to its subject. By the end of the 19th century, due to China's increasing contact with the West and the emergence of the sense of nationalism, Nianhua also began to address political issues, some becoming learning window for the new culture from the West. Others took up satire, informing people of China's compromising political situation. However, most of them were still created by nameless artists, and famous art did not participate in the creation of Nianhua until 1940s. Chapter 2, Japan and the New Orders in East Asia. Historically, Sino-Japanese culture exchanges were dominated by a China-centered mentality from the Chinese perspective. This relationship changed quickly in the late 19th century with Japan's rapid westernization and industrialization after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. On the one hand, Japan played a key role in China's education in the Western culture, and a handful of Chinese scholar officials such as Zhang Zhidong advocate a program learning from the West through Japan. After China's devastating defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, the influence of the Japanese aesthetic on Chinese art had also become increasingly noticeable. And for example, a number of the Chinese artists collectively known as the Shanghai School and the Lingnan School of Art absorb elements of the Japanese visual culture, especially the woodblock print ukiyo-e in their work. By the 1910s, the influence of the Japanese art upon Chinese consciousness also began to manifest in the domain of educational and political and propaganda images. The first modern publication organization in China, the Commercial Press, started its collaboration with a few Japanese bookstores, and some of their artists received direct training from their Japanese colleagues. Many political posters, cartoons produced during the Chinese Northern Expedition, which is the revolution from 1926 to 27, borrowed the style and the content of another popular Japanese pictorial genre that has became prevalent around the turn of the 20th century, manhwa. and the political cartoon fought at the frontiers of the visual conquest during the Northern Expedition. On the other hand, being China's agent for Western culture, Japan reiterated itself as a legitimate inheritor of the Orthodox East Asian civilization. As the 20th century got underway, Japan coined the term Toyu to emphasize a Pan-Asian cultural alliance. Toyu is a geocultural entity and encompassed the history and culture of the East, as opposed to the West, Saiyu. In 1937, Japan seized Manchuria and installed a pro-Japanese government with Puyi, the last Qing emperor, as a nominal regent and emperor. After Beijing was captured by the Japanese in December 1937, former Beiyang official Wang Kemin was appointed by the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, as a head of the new regime. And the old five-color flag was restored as its official banner. Meanwhile, ideology of the kingly way and the new order became the major slogans for the new government. The restoration of Puyi and Beijing, the previous emperor and capital city of several dynasties, served as an effective symbol for the Japanese troops to advertise themselves as a protector of the authentic Asian culture, promoting Confucian cultural renaissance. On November 3rd, 1938, Japan officially brought the concept of the new order in East Asia. Coordination of the occupation was placed in the hands of Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, through both the Tokyo headquarters and the collaboration of the local elite. The major propaganda agency tasked with appealing to the Chinese population on the behalf of IJA was the pacification unit, Sambuhan, and the Xinminkai, the New People Association in Beijing, with a number of the regional agencies based on the same model as the headquarters. The majority of their staff were Chinese people serving under Japanese advisors. After the exhibition of the Chinese Expeditionary Army in September 1939, Hodobu, the report department, was established, modeled after Sambuhan. Under the Hodobu, there was also the report units. They were responsible for propaganda work in northern China and communicate directly with the Tokyo headquarters. These agencies send out propaganda materials along with evident necessity as a way of pacifying the occupied Chinese audience. The major policy of Xinminkai was, one, to keep the new order and persuade the people to accept. Second, to develop the industry to improve people's livelihood. Third, propagate the East Asian culture. Fourth, fight and resist against communism. It also emphasized the unity between China, Beijing, Japan, Tokyo, and Manchuria, Changchun. In terms of effective visual strategy for the Chinese, the most direct approach was for this agency to reappropriate the visual convention found in traditional Nianhua. According to the document of the Chinese Expeditionary Army titled Advised on Propaganda Work in China, the Chinese people were not only predominantly illiterate, but also highly stubborn in clinging to old customers. Prior to the new year of 1938, the Japanese Beijing government dispatches policemen to give every household a New Year picture-like poster to paste on the wall to replace the New Year picture from the previous year. This poster generally adopted the visual motif with which Chinese people were quite familiar, often borrowing directly from the old Nianhua narrative. So the first popular topic, Zhonghui, the ghost hunter. Zhonghui is traditionally regarded as in the Chinese folklore as the vanquishing of the ghosts and evil beings. His image is often painted on household gates as a guardian spirit, as well as in places of business where the high-value goods are stocked. When portrayed as a ghost hunter, Zhonghui is usually displayed with bursting beard, a frown, and wide eyes, and his body leaning forward with a hand contoured out front. And one hand brandishes a sword, and the other hand usually is like either holding another demon or thrust into the air. his right foot stepping on the demon's body. And this dramatic, even manneristic rendering of the physical gesture evoke many classical depictions of protected icons in the traditional Asian folk art, such as Tao Tia or gate guardians. So this posters here, as you see, published around 1939 to 40, is an example of the IGA's appropriation of the traditional iconography of Zhonghui. The large inscription reads, "There will be persistent big chaos, the red demon does not die." And also their other inscription reads, "Absorbing communism and fight against Japan is killing China. Hope you will be awakened quickly and to construct a happy land together." And this colorful poster features a forceful figure holding a sword in his right hand, dressed in the traditional Chinese outfit, complete with bureaucratic boots and the cap, confidently striding on the body of the demon. His eyes widen and stare fiercely at the demon. His other hand is thrusting into the air before an auspicious rising sun in the background. Even without any overt explication, the viewer will be able to easily identify him as the ghost hunter Zhonghui. But the most obvious distinction between the poster and the conventional Zhonghui imagery is the background presence of the rising sun was raised to recall the Japanese military flag, which can also be seen as a source of strength for this particular ghost hunter. And his vanquished red demon features long finger and toenails and horns and fangs. Clearly, it represents communism. This demon is stout, muscular, with a barbaric yet fearful expression on his face. For people familiar with the popular Chinese folktales, and he would like to be recognized as an anthropomorphized beast or ghost, since communism was a foreign ideology that has been colored by Soviet politics. The poster was able to convince people that communism was an exotic but troublesome beast. The difference in age between the two figures is also emphasized. And as you see, this Japanese version of Zhonghui appears significantly older and more mature compared to the demon. And the plausible conclusion for this difference is that the New East Order in East Asia is traditional, protective, and native, whereas communism is foreign and disturbing. Another popular topic, Sima Guang and the vessel of communism. It is actually usually difficult to study reception of propaganda images generally. However, in the case of the Japanese one in China from 1938 to 1949, there have been some account and open remarks from the Chinese leaders, which in turn help us gauge the effect of the Japanese propaganda art in China. Speaking in January 1940, the Chinese Communist Party General Zhu De pointed out that the Japanese were exceptionally skillful at using visual resources, such as a large propaganda poster and small brochures, adopting visual element with traditional Chinese motif. Among all the old folktales, the Japanese seem to have harbored a special preference for the story of Sima Guang. As even Zhu De noticed that the Japanese had many occasions utilizing the story of Sima Guang as a metaphor for their relation with China. Probably everybody here, a lot of people here already know the story. Just let me summarize it very quickly. So when Sima Guang was a child and one of his playmates fell into a large ceramic vat and began to drown, the other children scattered in panic, but Sima Guang cracked the vat with a rock, saving the child. His calm decisiveness won him considerable praise. Although the story probably is fictional, it has remained popular in China up to present day. In October 1905, it was recorded in the newest edition of the China literature textbook for elementary school. A story titled Sima Wengong was included with an illustration. In this illustration, the calm Sima Guang offers a stark contrast with the startled children running away from the scene. With a line drawing technique and minimal attention to the strict perspective, it resembled many book illustrations published during China's Ming and Qing Dynasty by various commercial presses. Yet here in this large Japanese poster, the IJA had changed the story slightly to cater to its imperialistic strategy. A giant ceramic web set in the traditional Chinese garden landscape had been broken by a little Japanese soldier boy dressed in the IJA uniform. A Chinese boy is depicted flowing out of the broken vessel along with the stream of water and a rock used by the Japanese boy to break the web lies nearby. Unlike the early illustration, other children are absent in this Japanese poster, and the Chinese garden scenery is minimalized. So the viewer attention is easily directed toward the two figures of the Japanese soldier child and also the beleaguered Chinese boy, along with the Japanese national flag and the Chinese colored flag flying together atop the web. Unsurprisingly, intelligent Japanese soldiers are saving the Chinese people from their own ignorance and mistakes. And further symbolism is added by the 4 characters inscribed on the web, reading the vessel containing communism. Ergo, the Chinese people are drowning themselves in communism, and the vessel must be broken by the Japanese to save China. The major color in these posters are red, green, blue, and brown. According to the IJA military document, the second volume of the fast note on the ideology comeback lectures, the most popular colors for the Chinese Nianhua include red, blue, green, and brown. So colors were adopted which would appear most appealing to the Chinese general audience. Another important dimension of this illustration is emphasized on round faces in the 2 children. In northern China, a child play was a very popular Nianhua motif. Fat and round-faced happy children, their iconic feature including large heads, a wide forehead, chunky cheeks, and peaceful eyes and pillow lips, protruding chins were considered auspicious in China as symbolizing abundance of life. They were very popular with families who wished to produce a son or to have an opulent life to gain promotion in official rank. Next chapter, commercial calendar posters. In China's large cities, yuefenpai literally means advertising calendar poster became extremely popular with young people during the 1930s. Yuefenpai adopt elements from both traditional Chinese Nianhua and Western commercial culture. The most common format of a yuefenpai is a vertical rectangular shape with a large image in the center, usually a portrait of a beautiful woman or a small group of them. The goal of the yuefenpai was to promote business. Adoption of yuefenpai in common household in large cities were quite prevalent and was even observed by the famous Shanghai writer Alice Tseng in her most famous piece of the short fiction, wherein the heroine remembers the bedroom she shared with her sister, in which there is a yuefenpai featuring a beautiful, fashionable woman. And this poster serves as an example of the IJA's appropriation of this popular urban printed art form. 3 women are depicted in the center of the picture, and 2 are dressed in the yellow and the green and hold the 5 color flags. And the one in red is holding a Japanese flag. And a small boy is also holding a 5 color flag. The women with their round, heart-shaped faces, neatly painted pencil-thin eyebrows, a pink eyeshadow, and a matching color blush all follow the standard of the beautiful woman of the early 1930s and even in the 1920s, and arrayed in the latest fashion. Fashion is certainly not a primary theme here. However, rather the emphasis is on the relationship of a happy young mother with their chubby baby. The 3 women stand close together, arm in arm, and the young boys stand next to them, dressed in the traditional Chinese male long gown. The quartet being slender and pale and willow-like, sexually attractive, and we can see that the focus here is not the eugenic ideal that healthy mother gave birth to healthy children or the new athletic female beauty. And as advertised ever since Chiang Kai-shek New Life movement in 1934, instead, this poster celebrates an idealized Confucian society in which the harmony and the gender hierarchy persists. The pagoda in the background further promotes the notion of traditionalism. And in as much as Japanese had maintained its own dynastic lineage reaching deep into the past, it could therefore be perceived as an ideal model of Confucianism. Yet, the women's modern fashion served to reproduce for the viewer the pleasant, fondly remembered visual experience of looking at Shanghai Yuefenpai. Chapter 5, Resistance, the Second United Front between GMD and the CCP. Japanese imperialism and military aggression in China worked effectively and smoothly until the fall of Wuhan in October 1938, after which Kuomintang GMD launched several large-scale counter-offensive against IJA. The war of resistance superseded the ongoing conflict between the GMD and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and gave birth to the Second United Front. The CCP's Red Army was officially reorganized as a part of the National Revolutionary Army. While the GMD engaged the Japanese in the conventional battle, the CCP preserved its military strength, yet proved to be quite efficient in reorganizing the political department of the Central Military Command, a crucial agency in charge of political education, media relations, and propaganda. From its establishment in the 1920s, the CCP was quick to benefit from by becoming adept in an art at which the Soviet communists excel, that of transmuting the hope and fears of a mass audience into positive actions through the print imagery. The political department of the Central Military Command was reestablished in February 1938, with Chen Cheng as the chief director and Zhou Enlai as associate director. In April, Guo Moruo was appointed chairman in charge of anti-Japanese propaganda. The core mission of the Central Military Command was to coordinate military strategies for the Second Sino-Japanese War. In addition to the political department of the Central Military Command, there were also numerous political departments and the different institutions of the GMD military organization and a number of civilian anti-Japanese propaganda agencies as well. Countering to the Japanese idea of the new order in East Asia, the Chinese propagandists strove to utilize a variety of signs, symbol, and artistic technique to create their own propaganda art language. As a result, the GMD, the CCP alliance, created political poster with a quite different visual language, less sensitive to traditional symbols and more concerned with basic survival of the country and its people. And this poster, for example, offers an aesthetic impression that is strikingly different from the Japanese exemplars. A blunt caption reading, "It is an enemy or us," accompanies a depiction of the Chinese soldier in blue military uniform stabbing a Japanese soldier, and his sleeves are rolled up to his elbows, revealing the masculine lower arm and hand, while the Japanese soldier is so defenseless that he is unable to hold his own gun and puts up the last futile struggle as blood pours from his chest. There are not a great variety of color in this poster, probably due to lack of enough funding for printing colorful posters. However, the calligraphic lines of the image are effective in depicting the movement and a sense of nervous emotion. Needless to say, hatred of the foreign enemies became increasingly important as a component of the Chinese nationalism as the war progressed. In fact, the political department had already discovered during the Northern Expedition in the late 1920s that propaganda promoting hatred and resentment were generally more effective than any other for mobilizing the lower class. Generally speaking, the poster produced by the Chinese side have a more communist, or we say the Soviet undertone. In this poster, for example, a group of armored uniformed soldiers is depicted march into the bombed out area, which is probably a pictorial translation of the war frontier. On the left, a larger than life soldier stand upright, dressed in the military uniform and carrying a gun with one arm and a fist upraised. To the knowledge of many of us, raised fists are among the most widely adopted icons in Soviet propaganda art. The theatrical aesthetic celebrated by this poster impressed upon the spectator the earnestness of the national cause and the necessity of joining the army to fight in the field. The firm poster and intense expression of the figure type represent the ideal of the robust and stalwart soldier that was also typical Soviet propaganda art. The Soviet male hero of the Red Army became more or less leading icon in Soviet Russia. The color red is also used extensively in this poster, but unlike the auspicious red in Japanese works or Chinese Nianhua, red here means something totally different. Maybe the bloody nature of warfare sacrificed. Red, moreover, is also the color of communism. After the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Second Sino-Japanese War became a theater of World War II, and China officially became a member of an international anti-Axis alliance. Together with USA, the UK, the USSR, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the GMD, appeared more frequently in the print media. And this poster, for example, is titled "Military Comes First, Victory Comes First," and feature a portrait of Chiang Kai-shek against a background of a pattern formed by endless repetition of the new slogan, "Resist against the war, national construction," that was proclaimed around 1938 when new law was passed to prioritize the war. All political dissident was released and the CCP's legal standing was confirmed. In March 1938, the GMD held a meeting of 403 congressmen in Wuhan and determined that the two most important missions right now was to defeat the enemy and to construct the country. And Chiang Kai-shek became the unifying symbol for the pursuit of those national priorities. Meanwhile, this poster displays aesthetic qualities of critical woodblock print advocated by the left-wing writer Lu Xun in the 1930s. And it is very likely that the artists who produced propaganda posters were influenced by the emerging woodblock arts movement. Example you can see from the picture on the right. The Japanese valued the aesthetic quality and the prestige of the traditional form of ukiyo-e woodblock prints. But for Lu Xun, inspired by the German Expressionism, woodblock allowed for mass collaboration and mass production and had potential for political agitation. With their dramatic composition, chisel marks, arrangement of black and white, and representation of various objects in light and shade, the woodblock prints and the Lu Xun easily match the requirements of propaganda posters. Readoption Nianhua from Shanghai to the countryside. So the Shanghai-based Lu Xun woodblock print movement-inspired poster had their artistic root in the West. So the question nevertheless remained as to whether the Chinese populace in the countryside of northern China could actually accept those foreign visual languages. In fact, as Hong Changtai points out, the Chinese rural population found the woodblock movement inspired propaganda poster with their dull black and white colors and the dazzling composition extremely unappealing. Some peasants comment on this political woodblock print. The faces are too dark. Why is one side black and the other side white? I don't understand them. Since a number of the GMD CCP artists had come from Shanghai urban areas, they celebrate international art vocabulary like those of the German Expressionism. However, during the visual combat with the Japanese, the Chinese artists and leader encountered example of Japanese propaganda poster created for Chinese audiences and were impressed by their compelling appeal to the rural sensibilities. In 1939, the CCP accidentally discovered that the Japanese were producing new Nianhua with political motif, and that made them quite nervous. Soon enough, Zhu De, speaking in January 1940, alerted the CCP artists to the fact that the Japanese were exceptionally skillful in adopting the traditional Chinese visual motifs, especially in Nianhua element. As a result, he encouraged artists to render popularized and secularized, saying, quote, "We cannot abandon popular and secular element because of them being vulgar. After all, our works of art are not for a few people to look at, but to serve the Chinese general public and the military army. Since our enemies can take advantages of them and make them into weapons, we should also render them into our weapons. After Zhu's talk, some Chinese propaganda artists started taking their inspiration from the Japanese enemy. The CCP woodcut working group began to create a New Year picture to replace the existing style. According to Hu Yichuan's recollection, with the assistance of the underground network of the Communist Party of China and Yanhan's woodcut workshop, created more than 10,000 color woodcut New Year picture before the Chinese Lunar New Year in 1941, including Mao Zedong's portrait in the form of Zhonghui, and which soon sold out in the market. And similarly, this poster produced by Zhang Wenyuan under the GMD-CCP alliance offer another version of Zhonghui, very similar to the Japanese one we saw early, entitled "Congratulations on the New Year." And we see a soldier dressed in the GMD military uniform, brandishing the sword in his right hand and stepping over a blue-skinned demon. And his other hand arrogantly points to the demon, and who is wearing a khaki military uniform and a backpack with a Japanese military flag icon. The major color in this poster, red, yellow, blue, also common color used in Nianhua. Here, the color also served as a visual aid by which the audience can quickly identify the good and the evil, as in the Chinese theater tradition, wherein characters with dark colored skin tone are generally evil. The picture adopted traditional hierarchy scale as well, with the Chinese soldier depicted much larger than the Japanese demon. Speaking at the Yan'an Conference on Literature Art in May 1942, Mao Zedong stressed that the requirement of those foregoing new culture was to learn from the mass. So, for example, the specialist in the fine arts must pay attention to the arts of the masses. This is as close as Mao's Yan'an talk come to explicating the role of New Year picture in China's new culture by observing how their enemy, the Japanese, had created propaganda art, borrowing the style of Nianhua. The GMD CCP learned the value of this folk art, which eventually helped them to gain popular support from the rural population that has not been effectively marshaled by their early propaganda effort. Later, Nianhua-style woodcuts blossomed during the CCP's occupied region in northern China, spreading the image of the CCP leader. One example is this 1948 Nianhua. Pictorially, there are striking similarity between CCP chairman's picture and the old stove god image. And by a direct embrace of the visual motif of the traditional Nianhua that was familiar to the peasant class, this Chairman Mao poster not only attained adverse appeal to the masses, but also translated the chairman himself into a modern-day stove god. He is now taking on the symbolic powers of the stove god, making sure that everyone has food, land, jobs, and education. Worshipping the living deity instead of the dead ones became a catchphrase in many Chinese northern villages in the late 1940s. All right, we are finally coming to the conclusion part. Both the Chinese and the Japanese appreciate the effective of the visual in reaching the ordinary people with their messages, yet the differences between the political imagery favored by each side were quite evident. From the technical point of view, the Japanese political poster were of the higher quality due to the employment of a highly professional artist by the IJA, which was also better equipped financially. What is more striking about the Japanese poster, however, is the extent to which they relied on existing Chinese tradition. Despite their position as foreign invaders, the Japanese frequently vilified their Chinese opponent as a foreign influenced or communist, and ultimately a grave threat to the peaceful and harmonious Asian society being forced to enter the new order in East Asia. They deliberately merged the GMD and CCP together and portray the culture of their alliance as utterly anti-Asia. Occasionally, they depict China as a vulnerable child incapable of protecting itself and requiring the guidance of a wiser brother or benevolent mother. By this process, the IJA sought to encourage collaboration from the inhabitants of its new possessions by persuading local population that the occupation would ensure the ordinary life could carry on in peace and harmony. The political poster produced by the CCP-GMD Alliance, by contrast, focused on a completely different ethic and aesthetic at first, the human cost, which was generally absent from the Japanese political images, was the frequent topic of the Chinese posters, which consequently register as agitating and unsettling, employing simple yet dramatically contrasting colors and the stirring slogan in oversized characters. They served up visual provocations, approaching their audiences in more emotional terms with anger, suffering, and hatred as their primary themes. However, later, especially after the Zhude's remark and Chairman Mao Yan'an's talk, the CCP-GMD Alliance followed the Japanese example and looked to the Nianhua for inspiration. Ultimately, both sides heavily employed Nianhua as a visual resource for their propaganda. For the CCP, was a long time in coming to effective political strategies before the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War. At first, they borrowed from the Soviet model and dependent upon the advice of the Russian advisors. Later, as the CCP began to domesticate, both politically and aesthetically, their attitude toward Nianhua evolved from seeing relics of a superstitious and obsolete society to appreciating an art form by the people and for the people. From the late Qing Dynasty, the art of Nianhua was rerouted by politics of the different political groups to serve the specific agenda of different movement. As society changes, versatile Nianhua evolve accordingly. Developments such as the GMD CCP's creation of the image of an anti-Japanese Zhonghui, the Japanese invention of the image of a happy round-faced child, as well as the CCP version of the Mao Zedong as a stove god, are all examples of ways in which Nianhua stretched creatively from the traditional language of the art form to advocate change. Indeed, this traditional folk art had always come to stand for the revolutionary promises of utopia, yet it also served as a focus of collective delusions and the meeting points of all manner of anxieties. Thank you very much for your patience, and I would appreciate it for your question and comment.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. And let me first check on the Q&A. I see one question. Before I take that question, I'm wondering, am I allowed to ask the first question, perhaps?
Sure. Do you want me to keep sharing the slide, or do you want me to stop sharing the slide?
Well, I love looking at this comparison. So why don't we leave it on for now, and then if it's distracting, we could have you stop sharing. I just love the linkages that you made to clearly opposing political forces, right? We're talking about the Japanese Imperial Army, we have Kuomintang, we have the Communist Party, yet your paper so ingeniously showed us that at the end they ended up taking advantage of the same visual language of the Nianhua, and I just really enjoyed your talk, following everything that you showed us. I'm just curious, you did mention women in the calendar prints. Do we ever see female figures in the Nianhua, and what role would women serve in the kind of typical Nianhua imagery? Because you very convincingly told us about the deities, the round-faced children, but then the slender women showed up in the other type of print. So I'm wondering, do females ever show up in the Nianhua type imagery, and what function would they serve? What function would females serve in that kind of messaging?
Thank you for the question. And I think, from according to my knowledge, or as far as what I can see, there are not many examples of a female depiction in Nianhua. And probably the most popular depiction of female is the wife, the still god, and who always come together with her husband. And another popular motif for the female is the bodhisattva that would bring children to for the family prayers. And in that case, and it's more like a motherly figure instead of like, the attractive female type.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't think the female image usually appear as an independent female. It's always kind of in a relation to either a man or a child.
I see. Oh, and would that be reflective of Confucian values? The woman being either a mother or a daughter or a wife, but doesn't truly act independently?
Yes, that's correct. And actually, the term, the female sex, 女性, did not come into the invention of the Chinese language until the early 1920s. They also borrowed that term from the Japanese language. So before, the female was usually depicted as the daughter or the wife or mother. So even in terms of language, they were not independent.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So when we turn to this later period where the Japanese army, the Kuomintang, the Communist Party, appropriate the Nianhua, I guess, style and format, women still don't show up then, I assume. It's not just traditionally women don't show up in Nianhua in the kind of 1930s era with the appropriated Nianhua style. Women still don't show up?
No, women don't show up much.
That's fascinating because I'm thinking compared to Japanese propaganda for Japanese audiences of the time, women show up. I mean, yes, still in this very sexist, the importance of women as mother and wives, but they do show up in visual propaganda because it is still a kind of an iconic figure of women needing to do their part, right, for the war effort. And so it's interesting that here we don't see a somewhat similar appearance of females. Obviously not as independent agents, but at least as somebody who's part of this war effort.
I think it's very interesting because similar to the Japanese in the 1920s, 30s, and China also had this kind of a new woman concept, and also this kind of modern girl concept as well. But you don't really see a lot in print media except for the calendar posters. And you see a lot of their images in films and literature. And as far as, the wartime propaganda was concerned, as far as I can see, the women usually are shown as raped in some of the propaganda posters. So that's also not independent.
Right.
To agitate, okay, our woman being raped,
Oh no, that's terrible. Okay, well, let's go to our questions. I do see two right now. Okay, let's go to the first one from Shaoqian Zhang. Thanks for such an interesting and visually rich presentation. My question, it took an expert who possessed professional knowledge about China's long history and tradition to produce these propaganda posters. Do you have any idea if the Japanese hired local Chinese to work for their propaganda activities in the 1930s and 40s, or were these works entirely produced by Japanese?
Okay, that's a great question. And also you can see that, as I mentioned in my conclusion, that the Japanese poster, they seem to be created by professional artists. So it's not just anyone who would be able to do that. And unfortunately, I don't think I can totally answer the question because we could not really find the name of those artists that work for the IJA. But according to the primary document I read from the Japanese military government, most of them should be Chinese. And my intuition or my assumption kind of tell me that they could be very similar to the Chinese artists working for the commercial press in Shanghai. And they had a lot of trainings in Japan, or they'd receive some kind of trainings in China by the Japanese advisors as well. And it did not really require quite a long time. And some of them, maybe like the commercial press artists, we sometimes receive training for 6 months, then they can go to do that. So without affirmation, I suggest that most of the Japanese propaganda was created by Chinese and under the Japanese advisors, and maybe some were produced by the Japanese, because like Zhonghui was also a very well-known icon in Japan. I don't see why they cannot do that.
Right. Yeah. No, that is a great question. I do see, yes, the second question seems to be asking basically the same thing, were the Chinese artists involved? So you just answered that. So now we look at the next question. So this next question is from Meining Wang. Thank you for bringing us this very innovative research on propaganda posters and Nianhua. I'm curious about your research methodology of studying the prospective audience of these posters. Are there a lot of documents about noting the dissemination and viewers' responses to the posters? Are audience responses or reception included in your research? That's a great question, because I had the same thing. How do we even know what the responses were to these imagery?
Yeah, I think that's a general challenge for the study of propaganda. We can see the intended audience. We can also see the creation of the propaganda, but it's very hard to gauge the reception. But the reception was so important in the the whole flow of propaganda. I think fortunately for my study, we were able to find some of the responses. And compared to some of the early, the Chinese poster created during that Northern Expedition, it's very hard to find any notes on reception. But for this period, like as far as the Japanese reception of Japanese propaganda poster were concerned, and we did have a lot of the Kuomintang and the CCP document and talking about how scared they were looking at the effective of Japanese posters. So, I mean, if they were able to draw attention of the CCP leaders, so I would assume they were quite persuasive, and they also called them to learn from their enemies. So I would say that it says something about the effectiveness of the Japanese propaganda, although we cannot really put the data, to it.
Right. I wonder how they were measuring effectiveness, right? When they were saying, we're so scared it's so effective. I wonder how they were determining that effectiveness. So, I mean, is it by the volume of how many posters were actually circulating? Or I wonder.
I think they also, they probably it's hard for them to gauge the reception, but they had some strategies to promote reception. For example, when Beijing was occupied, they sent the New Year picture along with the food and the clean water. So, it's kind of like, those posters came with evident necessity. So that would really help with reception.
Yeah.
The material things.
Right. Okay, we have time for one last question. It's from Marianne Villavert, and she said, I have a question about the red demon character. Do you see this figure appear in modern propaganda? And does it still represent the sentiment of communism as it did in your example? So the red demon.
You mean the modern propaganda in China? That's not possible because red demon now is the government.
Right, I know,
right. And it might be possible for some kind of an anti-CCP group in contemporary China using the image of red demon, but they probably...
Right, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be coming out of China, obviously. But
Yeah, it would be
no,
under censorship.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So coming from the Japan side, I mean, there's no obvious propaganda in our era. So
Yeah, I guess the only possible way is to look at Taiwan propaganda depicting the mainland after 1949.
right, yeah. Yeah, that I have you looked into that? Is that part of your research?
I have not looked into that. That would be interesting to look at.
Right.
And also probably because right now the CCP was so much more powerful compared in the 1940s. So it could be something bigger than a red demon, maybe like a red dragon.
Right. Just simply the color red, which, you know, when you were doing your presentation, I thought that must have been slightly confusing for the 1930s because Japan was, you know, known as the big red rising sun, right? And then the same color red would be representative of the Communist Party as well. So kind of that color red, as you can see in these examples still on the screen here, it's actually quite confusing, possibly for the viewer, exactly what these big patches of red in a poster could be signaling, right?
Yeah, like in this context, red is like communism, and yeah, I think for the Japanese just really simplify the strategy by making the red demon look Caucasian and Western.
Right. I mean, there's so much more to talk about, but I see that we're now 1 minute past the hour. So should I pass this back to Kei Ueda? And sadly, we might have to bring this to an end since we are supposed to end on the hour. But I would like to say thank you so much, Dr. Zhang. That was so fascinating. I think you not only answered many questions that many of us already have, but you kind of opened up a whole new kind of set of possibilities, right? There's just, you know, especially this question of reception. I think we're all very eager to figure out if there's more we can learn about how these posters and Nianhua were received in their own time.
Thank you very much for your question and your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shaoqian Zhang and Alice Tseng, for a great presentation and discussion. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Please remember to visit our gallery at Hoover Tower and online. We hope you enjoyed this presentation, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next Fanning the Flames speaker series, featuring a virtual gallery tour, live Q&A, and discussions about the behind-the-scenes work for the Fanning the Flames exhibition. Please join us at 4 p.m. Pacific time on July 7th.